On the night of April 1st, 2006, a 27-year-old medical student walked into a bar in Columbus, Ohio, and was never seen again. No body, no trace, no explanation, just gone. And here's what makes this case truly haunting. He vanished from a building surrounded by cameras, and not a single frame of footage shows him leaving. How does someone just disappear? That is the question that has tortured investigators, consumed internet sleuths, and broken an entire family for nearly 2 decades. And today, we are going to go deep, real deep, into one of the most baffling missing persons cases in American history: the disappearance of Brian Shaffer. Let's start with who Brian was, because to understand how someone vanishes, you first have to understand who they were. Brian Shaffer was not some troubled kid with a complicated past. He was not someone you'd expect to find on a missing persons report. He was, by all accounts, the kind of person you'd want your son to be. Born and raised in Columbus, Ohio, Brian grew up in a close-knit family. His father, Randy Shaffer, was a deeply devoted man. His mother, Renee, was the kind of warmth that holds a family together. Brian was smart, genuinely, impressively smart. He enrolled at Ohio State University and eventually made it into medical school, the Ohio State University College of Medicine. That's not something you stumble into. That takes years of discipline, sacrifice, and focus. But Brian wasn't just books and studying. People who knew him described him as funny, outgoing, magnetic. He had this easy charm about him. He could walk into a room and just connect with people. His girlfriend, Alexis Waver, had been with him for years. She loved him deeply. His friends respected him. His professors saw real potential in him. By the spring of 2006, Brian was finishing up his first year of medical school. It had been an exhausting year and a painful one. Just weeks before, his mother, Renee, had passed away from leukemia. That loss hit Brian hard. It hit the whole family hard, but Brian was processing it. He was still showing up, still moving forward. Spring break had just begun, and Brian, like any young man who'd been grinding through one of the hardest years of his life, wanted to blow off some steam. On the night of March 31st, going into April 1st, 2006, Brian and a small group of friends decided to go out on what Columbus locals call the Bar District on High Street. It's a stretch of bars and restaurants that Ohio State students have been crawling through for generations. It's loud, it's crowded, it's alive. The plan was simple: go out, have drinks, celebrate surviving the first year, be normal college kids for one night. That was the plan. What happened instead changed everything. The group started the night at a place called Ugly Tuna Saloona. It's a popular bar right in the thick of the High Street Strip. Brian was there with his girlfriend Alexis and another couple, their friends Clint Florence and Meredith Reed. The night started the way these nights always do: drinks, music, laughter, the relief of just being out. Brian seemed okay. People who were with him that night say he was in decent spirits. Was he dealing with grief? Of course. His mother had just died, but he wasn't falling apart. He was present, he was social, he was Brian. At some point during the evening, Alexis and Meredith decided to step out briefly, to check out another bar nearby. The plan was simple. They'd go, come back, and the group would continue the night together. Brian stayed at Ugly Tuna. That was the last time Alexis ever saw him. When she and Meredith returned to Ugly Tuna Saloona, Brian was gone. They waited. They called his phone. Nothing. They figured maybe he'd stepped out to get some air. Maybe he'd wandered to another part of the bar. They searched, they asked around, but Brian was just not there. His phone went straight to voicemail, and it never rang again. Now here's where this case goes from strange to absolutely mind-bending because of the cameras. Ugly Tuna Saloona had a security camera system, multiple cameras positioned at the entrance, the exit, and various points throughout the bar. This was a crowded bar on a busy night, and the cameras were rolling the entire time.
Investigators pulled all the footage. They went through every frame. And what they found, or rather, what they did not find, is the single most disturbing element of this entire case. Brian Shaffer is clearly seen on camera entering Ugly Tuna Saloona that night. You can see him, right there, walking in, alive, with his friends. But he is never, ever seen leaving. Not through the front door, not through any exit, not on any camera angle. He walked in, and according to every piece of surveillance footage available, he simply ceased to exist inside that building. How does that happen? Investigators were baffled. How do you enter a building on camera and never leave? There were only two exits to Ugly Tuna Saloona, the main entrance on High Street and a side exit. Both were covered by cameras. The footage showed no sign of Brian leaving through either one. There was one potential explanation that detectives focused on, a construction scaffolding that was temporarily attached to the outside of the building. The scaffolding was there because of renovation work being done on the bar, and critically, there was a portion of this scaffolding that may have provided a way out that wasn't directly captured by the cameras. It's possible, investigators theorized, that Brian used this scaffolding area to exit the building without being clearly recorded. Maybe he slipped out through a gap. Maybe the camera angle just missed him. It's a theory. It's the most logical explanation for how he could have left without appearing on footage. But here's the thing. Even if we accept that Brian somehow slipped out through the scaffolding unrecorded, that only answers the question of how he left the bar. It does absolutely nothing to answer where he went next, because after that moment, Brian Shaffer left behind zero trace. No ATM withdrawals, no credit card activity, no phone calls, no sightings, no body, nothing. A 27-year-old man in a major American city simply ceased to exist. The investigation that followed was intensive by any standard. Columbus police threw serious resources at this case, and as Brian's disappearance became national news, the pressure to find answers only increased. His father, Randy, this man, Randy Shaffer, became the face of the search for his son. He went on news programs. He participated in press conferences. He worked with private investigators. He plastered flyers across Columbus. He spent years and years chasing every lead, every tip, every rumor. You have to understand what this does to a parent. Randy had already lost his wife, Renee, to leukemia just weeks before Brian disappeared. And then his son vanishes into thin air. This man endured the kind of grief that most of us genuinely cannot comprehend. And through it all, he refused to stop. He refused to give up. He kept going because Brian deserved that. Randy Shaffer passed away in 2008, never having gotten answers about what happened to his son. He died not knowing, and that detail sits with me every time I think about this case. Investigators explored every possible direction in those early months and years. The question of Brian's mental state was examined carefully. Was he suicidal? Was the grief from his mother's death pushing him toward a breaking point? People who were close to Brian push back hard on this theory. They say he was sad. Of course he was sad, but he was not in that kind of darkness. He had plans. He had a future. He was in medical school. He had a Lexus. He had things to live for. But grief is complicated, and the loss of a mother, especially when you were close to, can do things to a person that even their closest friends might not see. So investigators couldn't completely rule this out. Another direction they looked was foul play. Could someone have hurt Brian that night? Could there have been a confrontation, an altercation, something that turned violent? The bar scene on High Street on a Friday night is not exactly a quiet environment. Things happen. People get into it sometimes. But here, too, investigators couldn't find evidence pointing clearly in that direction. No witnesses came forward saying they saw a fight involving Brian. No one reported seeing him being dragged out or confronted aggressively. The surveillance footage, incomplete as it was, didn't show an obvious physical altercation involving him. There was also the theory, darker and more disturbing, that Brian may have taken his own life somewhere, and his body simply hadn't been found. Columbus has the Scioto River running through it. Drowning victims can sometimes remain submerged for extended periods. Searches of the river and surrounding areas were conducted. Nothing was found. Then came a lead that cracked this case wide open in the media and ultimately led to more questions than answers. In 2008, 2 years after Brian vanished, a man named William Strubing was arrested on unrelated charges, and through that investigation, a story emerged that connected, or at least seemed to connect, to the Shaffer case.
Strubing allegedly confessed to knowing something about Brian's disappearance. There were claims that Brian had been killed and his body disposed of. This sent shockwaves through the case. Finally, a lead. Finally, maybe, answers. But the more investigators dug into Strubing's account, the more it fell apart. His story was inconsistent. The details didn't check out. There was no physical evidence to corroborate what he was saying. Law enforcement ultimately concluded that his account was not credible. Another dead end. There were other tips over the years. There always are in high-profile missing persons cases. People call in with supposed sightings. Someone claims they saw Brian in another city. Someone says they knew someone who knew something. Each one gets investigated. Each one goes nowhere. In 2015, 9 years after Brian disappeared, there was a development that briefly reignited hope and horror simultaneously. A tip led investigators to a condo complex. The tip suggested that Brian's body might be located there, specifically inside a wall or a concealed space within the property. This sounds like something out of a true crime novel, but it was serious enough that law enforcement actually executed a search. They brought in cadaver dogs. They searched the property thoroughly. They found nothing. Let's talk about the internet's role in this case, because it is genuinely one of the most amateur-sleuthed cases in the history of online true crime communities. When Brian Shaffer's story spread across the internet, it became a magnetic mystery for thousands of amateur investigators. Forums lit up, Reddit threads went deep, YouTube videos dissected every frame of the available surveillance footage. People mapped out the scaffolding, people researched the layout of the bar, people created timelines down to the minute. One particular area of obsession became the question of what exactly can be seen in the surveillance footage in the final moments before Brian disappears from frame. Some amateur investigators claimed they could see Brian speaking with 2 women near the entrance of the bar shortly before he vanishes from the footage. These women were identified by some, though investigators were never able to definitively confirm who they were or what relevance they had. Who were these women? Did they know Brian? Did they see something? Did they leave with him through the scaffolding? These questions have been circulating for years and remain unanswered. The internet community also explored the possibility that Brian staged his own disappearance. This is a theory that comes up in many long-term missing persons cases. The idea that someone, for whatever reason, decided to walk away from their life entirely, start over somewhere new, leave everything behind. Could Brian have done that? The people who loved him say absolutely not. Alexis, who remained devoted to finding answers about Brian for years, maintained that the man she knew would never just abandon his life, his family, his future without a word, not after everything, not during a period when his father had just lost a wife and needed his son. That's not who Brian was. But here is the cold, uncomfortable truth that investigators will tell you. People do sometimes walk away. It happens more than most of us realize. Whether it's mental health, financial pressure, personal crisis, or simply the overwhelming desire to escape, some people choose to disappear, and sometimes they succeed. There is no evidence that Brian Shaffer is alive somewhere, living under a different name. But there is also no body, no confirmed cause of death, no certainty. And that absence of certainty is its own kind of torment. Let me walk you through the timeline one more time, because sometimes when you slow everything down, you catch things that rush past you on the first read. March 31st, 2006. Brian and his group arrive at the High Street Bar District. They're celebrating spring break, the end of a rough year. Brian is with Alexis, Clint, and Meredith. They're at Ugly Tuna Saloona.
At some point, the exact time is disputed in various accounts, but it's somewhere in the late evening. Alexis and Meredith leave Ugly Tuna to briefly visit another nearby bar. Brian stays behind. This is the last confirmed sighting of Brian Shaffer while he is known to be alive. Surveillance footage captures Brian at the entrance of Ugly Tuna. This is the last footage of him. He is not seen on any camera leaving the building. April 1st, 2006, early morning. Alexis and Meredith return to Ugly Tuna. Brian is not there. Phone calls go to voicemail. The following day, Brian is reported missing. From that point on, nothing. Not a single confirmed sighting, not a single transaction, not a single communication. Nothing. Brian Shaffer was 27 years old. He stood about 6 feet tall. He had brown hair and brown eyes. If you've never seen his face, look him up, because his face matters. Missing persons cases are not just puzzles, they are people. And Brian Shaffer was a real person with a real family who loved him. One of the questions I keep coming back to when I think about this case is what was going through Brian's mind that night? He had just lost his mother. He was in the middle of medical school. He was out with friends trying to have a normal night, and then something happened. Something that we still, nearly 20 years later, cannot explain. Did he step outside to get air and something went wrong? Did he meet someone? Did something happen to him? Did he make a choice? We don't know. And the not knowing, the absolute vacuum of information, is what makes this case so uniquely haunting. Most missing persons cases, even the ones that stay cold for years, have some kind of thread, a last known location that's definitive, a piece of evidence that at least points a direction, a witness who saw something. Brian Shaffer's case has a camera that watched a door, and he never came out of it. There is something almost philosophically disturbing about that. We live in an era of surveillance. We are tracked, we are recorded, we leave digital footprints everywhere we go. The idea that someone can simply vanish without leaving any trace in our modern world, it shakes something in us. If Brian can disappear without a trace in a crowded city bar on a busy night with cameras rolling, what does that say about how much we actually know, how much we can actually see? It's unsettling, and I think that's part of why this case has never left the public consciousness. It's not just about Brian Shaffer specifically, though it absolutely is about him. It's about what his disappearance forces us to confront about the limits of what we can know and see and find. Let me tell you about Alexis for a moment, because she deserves more than a footnote in this story. Alexis Waver lived with the uncertainty of this case for years. She spoke about Brian publicly. She participated in searches for answers. She held on to the relationship and the memory of the man she loved. And then life moved forward because it has to, because it's the only direction it goes. At some point, Alexis moved on. She got married, she built a new life, and I don't say that with any judgment whatsoever. When the person you love vanishes with no explanation and no resolution, you cannot be expected to freeze time forever. You have to find a way to keep living. But that doesn't make the questions go away. It doesn't close the wound. Somewhere in Alexis is still that woman who came back to a bar one night and couldn't find Brian and never found him again.
His friends carry it too. Clint Florence, who was with Brian that night, has spoken about the case over the years. The guilt that can accompany surviving something like this, being right there and still not knowing what happened, is its own specific kind of weight. As of today, the case of Brian Shaffer remains officially open. He has never been declared legally dead. There is no arrest record in connection with his disappearance. There is no confirmed cause of death. There is no confirmed location of remains. He is simply missing. 20 years. A new generation of true crime investigators has grown up with this case. New tools exist now. Better facial recognition, better forensic technology, better digital tracking capabilities. And yet, nothing new has emerged. Some investigators believe that the scaffolding exit theory is the most likely explanation for how Brian left the bar undetected, that he slipped out through a gap in the camera coverage, possibly in an emotional distress given his mother's recent death, and either harmed himself somewhere or made a deliberate choice to disappear. Others believe that something darker happened, that Brian encountered the wrong person or the wrong situation after leaving that bar, and that someone knows more than they've ever said. And some, a smaller group, still hold out hope, still believe that somewhere out there, Brian Shaffer is alive, living under a different name, a different life, for reasons we may never fully understand. What do I think? I think the truth of what happened to Brian Shaffer is almost certainly simpler and more heartbreaking than any elaborate theory. I think a young man who had just buried his mother, who was carrying grief that most of us will never fully grasp, stepped out into the night in some state of anguish. I think the scaffolding gave him an exit that the cameras couldn't fully capture. And I think what happened after that exit may have been the last decision Brian Shaffer ever made. But that's just a theory. It's my read of the available information, and I could be entirely wrong. The truth is, nobody knows, and that is the cruelest part of all of this. Brian Shaffer's family deserved answers. Randy Shaffer deserved to know what happened to his son before he himself passed away. Alexis deserved closure. His friends deserved to understand. And Brian, if he is gone, deserved to be found. Missing persons cases are not just cold case files gathering dust in a police department somewhere. They are open wounds. They are families forever frozen in a moment of not knowing. Every holiday, every birthday, every anniversary, the question is still there. What happened? Where is he? Is he okay? For the Shaffer family, those questions will likely never be answered. Randy is gone. The family has endured decades of silence, and Brian, wherever he is, has not come home. If you know anything at all about the disappearance of Brian Shaffer, the Columbus Police Department's case remains open. Tips can still be submitted. Leads can still be followed. Because that's the thing about cases like this. They don't close until there's an answer, and there is still no answer. A 27-year-old medical student walked into a bar on High Street in Columbus, Ohio, on the last night of March 2006. The cameras watched the doors, and he never came out.